Lance Luce on the Barton organ, the little Xavier Cugat. Tico, tico, ti, tico, tico, ta. Thank you, Lance. Welcome to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. My name's Christina Hamilton. I'm the director of the series. And today we are thrilled to present journalist and cartoonist Joe Sacco. Yeah. And also thrilled that today is a co-presentation with the International Institute's Conflict and Peace Initiative. A big thank you to them for embarking on this with us, and also a thank you to the 26 additional supporters. As you will see, we are not going to read through the list, but if you're all here in the house, a big thank you to all of you. Tremendous support, tremendous support. And a big thank you to Ashley Bates for bringing them all together. And of course, our series partners, Arts Engine and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM. So, a special welcome to you if you are joining us today for the first time because you are a part of one of these different groups, or you've been brought in by CPI and had never been to the Penny Stamp Series before. For those of you who have no idea who we are, the Penny Stamp Series is a program through the Stamp School of Art and Design. We look to present creators and innovators like our distinguished guest today as a way for our students to connect with creative leaders of the day. And we are here at the Michigan Theater every Thursday at 5:10 p.m., always free. And you can pick up, we have a new calendar for our winter season that just came out. Pick one up on your way out and plan to join us. You can find us online, you can find us on Facebook. Plan to join us same time, same place on Thursdays. Our co-presenter today, the Conflict and Peace Initiative, was just launched at the University of Michigan this September, and this is its first official event. The initiative is dedicated to advancing a deeper understanding of the root causes, dynamics, and consequences of conflict and peace. All of its projects will involve collaborative partnerships, like today, across disciplines, and ongoing engagement with anti-violence and anti-discrimination and advocacy groups. So, look for more to come. Please do remember to turn off your cell phones. We are not going to have our regular Q&A today, but we are going to have a book signing in the lobby. So if you want to say hello to Joe, you can join the book signing. This is going to happen directly after. And I have been asked by the theater personnel that if you're going to be in line for the book signing, they want to have the line going up the stairs and around. And this will be fantastic for you because we also have with us today a very special musical concert out in the lobby with two musicians from the Jutour Ensemble of Amman, Jordan. They seek to revive roots of Arabic music by developing the Middle East instrumental heritage for contemporary appreciation. And their performance features the duo Abdul Wahab Kayali on the oud and Mohammed Taboub on the violin. You may have heard them on your way in. They are going to play during the book signing as well. So you can catch them then. And tomorrow evening, they'll be playing in Detroit at Trina Sof's. So many opportunities. Now, to set the stage for today, we will be presenting a conversation, which I'm sure you figured out. And to lead the conversation, we have happened on Just the Right Guy and our partner today, Christian Davenport. Christian Davenport is a professor of political science. He's also the director of the Conflict and Peace Initiative at the University's International Institute. His primary research interests include political conflict, human rights, racism, and popular culture. He is the author of 6 books, most recently, How Social Movements Die and The Peace Continuum. One of Christian's current projects is a book called Pop Struggle, which explores repression and dissent in film, comics, and graphic novels. And joining him, of course, is our guest of honor today, Joe Sacco. A little bit on Joe. Joe Sacco calls himself a cartoonist who makes comics, and he does not subscribe to the term widely used for his work of graphic novels, as he does not see his work as novels. His work chronicles history through genocides, wars, and injustices in the US and around the world. He has been called the moral draftsman, credited with producing 2 masterpieces of comics journalism, and praised for bringing the recent history of the Middle East and Bosnia to life more vividly than most journalists and documentary makers. His books include Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, Footnotes in Gaza, Safe Area Goražde, and The Great War. All of these books, I believe, all of these titles I did see on the table outside in the lobby. Sacco has received many awards for his pioneering work, including the 1996 American Book Award, a 2001 Guggenheim Fellowship, 2001 Eisner Award, the 2010 Ridenhour Book Prize, and the 2012 Oregon Book Award. I don't know if you all saw, reported last night in the Michigan Daily, there was a nice piece talking about Joe coming here to speak today. And in it, it said, when asked to describe his work in one sentence, Sacco said, "The reality I see, it's completely subjective. I cannot be the monopoly on the concept of truth." Sacco's vantage is that the most important thing for people to know when reading and observing his work is that journalism is imperfect. But journalism, in all its various mediums, whether broadcast, print, or radio, has the ability to alter the world. Perhaps more now than ever before, today's social climate demands that inquisitive and self-aware journalists like Joe Sacco remain critical in the work that they do in order to preserve the integrity of the media and defend the notion of truth. I thought that was great reporting in the Michigan Daily. Please welcome to the stage Joe Sacco and Christian Davenport.
Hello? Y'all hear us? Call and response. Y'all hear us? Yes. Wow, seriously? You're going to do like that? Okay. Okay, so special thanks to Penny Stamps. What's up? Yep. Oh, much better. Thank you. Sorry. Special thanks to Penny Stamps in facilitating and co-presenting this event alongside with the International Institute's Conflict and Peace Initiative, which I direct. Special thanks to our 26 plus co-sponsors, which was an amazing kind of dynamic once Joe had signed on and was coming, everyone was coming out the woodworks to basically come here, and that's a really amazing thing. Joe, welcome to the University of Michigan and to the Michigan Theater. It's an honor to have you here, as I've said several times since you've been here. You're actually the first conversation that CPI has had. There's many reasons for that, which we'll get to. CPI seeks to engage individuals from different fields and subdisciplines and orientations about the subject of conflict and violence and peace. And trying to bring those people together is not the easiest thing to do. So we actually seek out people who are unifiers in many respects, people who compel other individuals to kind of come forward outside of your box. And so your work speaks to so many different people on so many different levels. And so this is one of the reasons for having you here. So I think the 26 sponsors and the Michigan Theater makes you kind of, you should feel embraced by the U of M family, basically, is the point. And so please feel free to do that. Today, our conversation is going to sound a little bit like it's somewhere between like This Is Your Life, and anyone remembers that old TV show, This Is Your Life? You'd like pull somebody out and be like asking questions about their life. And
my mom is backstage, I bet.
Oh, you saw her already. I thought we hid that well. Okay, my bad. And kind of like inside the actor's studio, so it's kind of like a hybrid in between that. But it's really a moment to reflect about your work as an artist, your work as an advocate for human rights, your work as a peacemaker, and I will argue your work as an educator. And so we're really going to kind of like jump in many respects and think about what you're kind of doing. You might want to look back every now and then because we'll refer to some of your stuff. But kind of please begin with like, tell us your personal story and your creative journey of sorts into comic and graphic novel genre. I mean, like, how did you get started? Why did you get started? Who got you started?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to all the people that you thanked, and to the Michigan Theater. A lot of people had a hand in having me come out, and thanks to Christian. I was drawing since I was a kid. Basically, my sister and I would draw comics. And we had both stolen a cartoon character from an English magazine. I grew up in Australia, that's why it was English. And we would fight over who had stolen it first. And I mean, little by little, I just kept going with it. But I never, not in a million years, when I was in high school or even in college, did I think that was a career path. I didn't think in those terms. I studied journalism. And I wanted to write hard news. That's what interested me, is like who, what, when, where, why, and how. And my dream was to work on a newspaper. But that dream sort of didn't come to pass. After I graduated from the University of Oregon, there were no jobs for journalists, really, who just came out of school. There were a lot of journalists coming out of school. Everyone had watched All the President's Men, and everyone wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein.
Who doesn't?
Yeah. So I didn't like the journalism jobs I ended up getting, and at some point I got pretty frustrated, and I just decided, I'm still drawing. I'd been drawing continually, but sort of as an offshoot artistic project for myself, and then I thought maybe I can make a living at that. And 15 years later, I could make a living at it. It took a long time. If you want to know how I got into journalism, or how I got into comics and journalism, is that?
Yeah, they have that kind of combo.
Right. Well, I started doing comics that was satire, funny stuff. That's kind of why I got into comics, because I like to make people laugh. But, I studied journalism, and of course I cared about what was going on in the world. And I cared a lot about what was going on in the Middle East, for whatever reason. So by the time I was trying to scratch out a living doing comic books, I was living in Berlin doing rock posters and album covers. That's generally how I was able to scrape by. I thought, I'm just going to go to the Middle East and spend time in the West Bank and see if I can do a series of comics about this.
Why'd you pick the West Bank first?
Well, I was interested in the Palestinians.
Okay.
That's another. We can get into why that particular reason. We can get into that, but I thought, okay, I see a lot of comics, and there's a lot of navel-gazing in comics. There are a lot of comics I can't really relate to. I wanted a comic that I would read, and I wanted to read about something politically going on. And I thought I would love to read something about the Middle East. And I thought, well, just go and do it. So it was just a matter of getting up some courage, saving up a little money, and going. And I didn't really know what I was doing, to be quite frank. I didn't have like this vision in mind. I'm going to do comics in journalism in comics form. It was more like, I'm going to go see what my experiences are and just sort of maybe do a travelogue or autobiographical stuff that has some political stuff. But when I got there, right away, I just began asking those journalistic questions, because that's what I studied, and that was kind of in my blood. And that's sort of where it began.
Like, who kind of intrigued you or inspired artistically with regards to kind of like the initial kind of comic form, or no one?
Initially, it was the old Mad magazines, Mad comics, I should say, not Mad magazines. The comics from the 50s, they were so outrageous and so wild, and there was so much detail in them that I liked that stuff. And then later on, it was Robert Crumb. I loved the old 60s underground comics. I loved the freedom of them. And sometimes they had a political point, often they didn't. But there was a freedom about them that I really appreciated.
I'm always, anyone who's like into Robert Crumb, everyone like Robert Crumb? Yeah. That I always found to be a truly kind of like amazing experience. He's a ride that you just kind of don't come off of in many respects, because it goes in so many different ways. So that's what's the first Crumb one that you saw, actually?
Well, actually, the first Crumb stuff I saw was really, I didn't like Crumb when I first saw him, because I think almost the first thing I saw was Angel Food McSpade.
Oh, wow.
And when that was like very intense, I didn't get that at all, and it just, I mean, it's racist. It's hard to sort of get around that.
Yeah.
And, you know, Crumb says it's just lines on paper. And I've never really subscribed to that, but I don't think deep down Robert Crumb's a racist. So I've learned slowly but surely, I got back into his work and learned to really appreciate who he was as an artist.
Very cool. These are some images from Palestine. One of your successes, I would argue, of your work has been your ability to kind of expose social injustices to audiences, newer and perhaps maybe the same audience, but in a different way, that would otherwise be ignorant or unsympathetic to the topic. I think that's a powerful aspect of what it is that you do. The role of narration and image and sequence seems to be crucial for you achieving this, but can you talk a little bit about what you don't want to call it graphic journalism, what your approach, can you talk a little bit more about what your approach is in the combinations of these elements and why you think it is particularly useful medium for discussing social injustices?
Well, to be honest, I never thought of it as a particularly, I didn't think of it as particularly, great way of telling social injustice to get into social injustice issues. I was just a cartoonist. So, truth be told, I think if I were a filmmaker, I would have gone to the same places.
Wow.
So it's not as if I thought this would be a great way to tell these stories. To be honest, I wasn't sure if it was a great way to tell those stories. I was just trying to see where it would go. And initially I thought, well, this is where my career ends, trying to do this sort of thing, because comics aren't generally about those things. I do think I've learned to understand more about why it is a good way to get to those sorts of things, but I think the main reason I would say is comics are just naturally subversive. And
why is that?
well, I think, let's say you don't know anything about the Palestinian conflict, and you see a very good book by someone who really knows that's about the Palestinian conflict, and you think, there's either that or there's this comic book.
Yeah.
And so it's strange because, on a very sort of surface level, comics look easy, and that's part of the subversive nature of them. They're appealing, they're visceral, and they're immediate. You open up, I hope, the comic book, and right away there you are in Rafah, in a refugee camp in Gaza. It's not this explanation that gets you there. And of course, I have great admiration for prose, and there's a lot I get out of prose. But if you're looking at the particular things about comics, it's just they grab you right away. You find yourself in a place, and repeated images of that place allow something about that place to sink in a way they might not in prose. In prose, you might mention one time that there was graffiti on the wall. But when you're in these refugee camps, everywhere you go, there's graffiti on the wall, and you can show that in the background of repeated images over and over again in the background. It's you're not even foregrounding it, but it's there always. So that it follows the reader around like it follows you around when you're there.
That's so profound. I remembered when I first went to Northern Ireland, and you go to Falls Road, and it was this amazing kind of characterization of you might have something in a newspaper or not, but what you have is this very detailed images on these walls, this graffiti. And someone always told me that if you wanted to go to Northern Ireland and figure out kind of what just during the Troubles, or the conflict, I'm told, is actually the correct label, not the Troubles, which was the British moniker. But you'd go to the Falls Road and you'd look and see what these images were to get a better sense of what was going on. So I think that that graphic depiction, that kind of power is something that's there. But on Gaza, Gaza is one of the most isolated places on the planet. What do you want readers to come away with feeling and understanding about Gaza from looking at your work?
Ultimately, it's that people in Gaza are human beings. That's, if you wanted to say what it all boils down to, these are people who are in a very difficult situation, basically trapped, living out living out history that never really ceases. As one guy told me, you know, events are continuous, meaning they've never stopped for these people. They never have time to digest their history because they're always living their history. They can't be nostalgic about their history. It's to give, I want to give people a sense of the history of what's happened to the people in Gaza, a sense of them as people, and an understanding of what it's like to be caged in.
So, what drives you to pick a topic? So, like some things that matter to folks, you're driven by hatred, you're driven by fear. You come across a book that makes you kind of want to explore it further. A painting, or you meet somebody. What kind of gets you to pick the topics that you pick?
Anger.
What got you to pick Gaza? Got you to?
Yeah. We can talk about.
Okay.
It's a sense of anger. I'm angry at the way things are. That feeling of unfairness or injustice, whatever that means, but you feel something in your gut. And I'm careful about how I pick topics because comics take a long time to draw. So you have to think to yourself, okay, 5 years from now when I'm still working on this book, will it still matter to me? And I mean, we can talk about these cases specifically if you want. If you want to talk about like what got me to go to Palestine in the first place, we can do that. I mean,
definitely.
It's this sense, growing up, I began to slowly understand that I thought Palestinians were terrorists.
Wow.
And that's how I looked at Palestinians. And it was a very long process of education and a lot was self-education that got me to think something else. Because really the only time the word Palestinian was ever used in a news broadcast, and remember, I'm not paying that much attention to what's going on in the Middle East, but you know, the evening news is on and you know, Palestinians launched Katyusha rockets into northern Israel. Palestinian commandos attacked a bus. All these things objectively true, but that was the only time I heard the word Palestinian, and there was never any context provided. Which eventually, my critique I began to understand that journalism, the subject I loved, was partly responsible for this because objective style reporting. And so there was a sort of an anger at how I felt the wool had been pulled over my eyes. And the first time that began to sort of change how I saw Palestinians was the time of the Sabra Shatila massacres in Lebanon in the early 1980s. When Israel invaded Lebanon, they surrounded some Palestinian refugee camps, and Christian allies, Lebanese Christian allies, went in and over a period of about 2 days killed hundreds of Palestinian men and basically allowed it to happen. And that was in the news, and it was obviously shocking, and my first thought was, I thought the Palestinians were the terrorists. And so I thought, okay, something else is going on. And then it was a question of picking up a few books, like what's going on? And I happened to pick up The Fateful Triangle by Noam Chomsky, which blew my mind. I mean, I remember reading it and then having to put it down and walking around the room because my stomach was hurting. I mean, I didn't realize how the culpability of the press in some of this stuff and what the US was doing. I knew none of this stuff. It was all new to me. And then I sought out a couple of more books. Then I lived in Europe for a while, and in Europe, their view of what's going on there is much more nuanced. But to be honest, it took me years to get to that point where I felt like I understood what was going on.
So do you find that you're kind of, that you're, in a sense, through the graphic novel, kind of like working out your understanding, or do you think after you come to a certain understanding, then you're doing the comic or graphic novel?
I always think I have a bit of understanding before I go there, but when I get there, that's when the understanding really happens. Often I go in with preconceived ideas, and some of them are played out and seem to be true, but others, you realize, oh, there's way more nuance here, or I didn't consider this aspect of it. So it's really being on the spot that really gives you insight. It's very important to read all the stuff you read beforehand, and I do a lot of research before I go, but you realize that's the tip of the iceberg, and oh, actually what they're really talking about is this. I didn't know. I thought it was like the Palestinians versus the Israelis before I went. And then you're in the Palestinian communities and you see the factions. And the factions are something that I didn't really read that much about, but then you try to learn very quickly. Yeah. And I mean, there's all kinds of nuances you never get until you go to a place.
So in a sense, though, are you working out I'm trying to figure out the creative element, right? Because you have the textual element and that kind of understanding, but then you're affixing this with these images. And so are you highly playful with both as you're kind of co-creating the elements to fit together? Are you kind of affixed to a particular like image and then you're finding that text, or do you have this kind of textual understanding? So some of the stuff I showed, you're very clear with regards to kind of your historic facts. You have them down, you're using maps, you're using those references, and then you'll see someone's face, or you'll see a sequence of events that's leading you to see a particular event, and then you're zeroing in on a part of it. So I'm wondering about, do you feel you have a sense of a commitment more to a word or a description or an image, or does that kind of co-evolve as you're proceeding to create?
I'd say at this point, I can't think of one without the other. Like sometimes I think, should I write a prose book? And then I think, I'd be a B- prose writer, I bet. Well, I'm not sure about prose anymore. Yeah. I'm very committed to the word, but I'm also very committed to the image. Yeah. And the way the way I work is there are stages, and in some ways, I won't say exactly separate, but in a lot of ways, maybe that would be a good way of describing them. There's research where I'll read about a place, then there's like the field work where I go, and I'm like one of those people who doesn't sketch. I know a lot of cartoonists, they have great sketch pads, and I'm always jealous of looking at their sketch pads, but I just don't make the time for that unless I have to do something that it's not possible to take a photograph for various reasons. And really what I'm interested in is talking to people. It's interviewing. And so I'm very much interviewing people, but thinking visually, like thinking, I'm going to have to draw this person's story, so let me ask the visual questions that will help me draw that story later on. Then I get back to, my home, and I transcribe all my tape, I get all my notes in order, I index them I'm very rigid about how I try to get all that done. And then I start writing a script, and I try, in the best circumstances, I write a complete script, and with scripts, I never know, it's gonna take me 6 weeks or 6 months, I never know. And then with drawing, I always know, I always can sort of judge, okay, I can get 8 to 10 pages done a month. It's like digging a ditch. It's like you know how far you're gonna get every day. And after I finish the script, I start drawing, and I don't storyboard at all. Because I want something spontaneous to happen 3-4 years down the road when I bring out that script and I say, okay, here's the script, what will I draw today? So I want something spontaneous to happen artistically that moment. And so I allow myself that. And that's why it doesn't feel like I've poured concrete on the story with storyboards. And a lot of cartoonists storyboard, so if you storyboard, if you're a cartoonist out there that storyboard, that's fine. I just don't do it myself.
There's James Karst, this professor from NYU, I think, studies religion. He had this principle of, he wrote this book called Finite and Infinite Games, and he argued there's like 2 different kind of games or ways of proceeding. And the finite one was like you went towards a particular end and then that was it. And the infinite game was trying to be constantly open for play. But it's interesting to hear you kind of describe it, because it seems like your work is a combination of both. There's some finite elements you'd like to finish at a certain point, but there's this openness to spontaneity and creativity that you're kind of overlaying with it, which is just kind of fascinating. Let me kind of comic geek out for a second, but you wanted to make this distinction between comics and graphics. And I'm just like, you prefer comic journalism as opposed to graphic journalism. I'm curious how you're characterizing or understanding these two, so I can get a better kind of sense for that.
Well, I never really liked the phrase, the term graphic novel, because I thought maybe that fit other work, but to me, novel sort of implies fiction. And so I don't think of a lot of my journalism work I don't think of it as fiction, so it felt like it didn't feel like a proper fit. But the other thing is just, I grew up with the word comics, and it didn't seem problematic to me. Though I recognize for people just getting into it, it seems a little more problematic. They think, well, what's comical about it? I mean, they could turn that around and also question that terminology. And, the way I look at it now is I'll call them comics, but if I'm describing what I do to someone I don't know, I'll often say graphic novel because they've heard that enough. And to me, that's a marketing term. They've heard it enough that they understand what that means. So, I think that battle is lost as far as I'm concerned. It's called graphic novel now, and I'll just live with that.
You get a section in a bookstore. It's not all bad, right? So, so I'm going to move to journalism a little bit and try to the book, not the concept. And part of what I found intriguing about this particular piece is your ability to combine traditions of reporting with history, memoir, imagery, memorialization, with a kind of running, very subtle and biting kind of oral critique and awareness. I mean, that combination I find to be very, very powerful. And it, I think, appears to be unique to your style. I think part of when I think of a Sacco-like creation, it's your ability to bring those things together. How do you see the different elements from these different mediums, right? So oral critique is one thing, memorialization is another, imagery is another, memoir is another. How do you see them independently and kind of like, do you see them as necessarily in reinforcing one another? Do you kind of take an image and then you kind of find the memorialization? Are you guided from one to the other? How do you combine them?
A lot of things happen really instinctually. So things sort of feel right as I'm going along, how I shift from one of these elements to the other. I'm often not theorizing about it as I'm doing it. In fact, I didn't theorize about my stuff at all until I first started getting interviewed, and then I was, you have to come up with explanations as to why you do things. And I understand why people want that, and I'm interested in process too, and why people do what they do. But I'd say for me, and I think for a lot of artists, a lot just comes from the gut. This feels like the right way to approach this.
I will squash that immediately, man. Good comment. Yes, occasionally I think we tend to try to affix individuals and put them in a box. So I don't want to put you in a box, man. I'm not going to do that. So let's.
I'm not feeling it. Don't worry.
Okay, good. But one of the pieces that I came across, I think, late in many respects, because the Great War was created, and I missed it for a while until I went to a friend's house, and they had it pinned to their wall. And so, for those that haven't seen the piece, it's this amazing characterization of war across the logistical dynamics from the front. How would you describe? So the piece is wordless, which I found to be phenomenal, and so that's partly how I want to start. What led you to make it wordless? Because you're so kind of historically minded at the same time, I could see prose and things going along with it, but there's no words with this at all. This one always struck me because you have this soldier smiling in the middle of it, and you wouldn't necessarily see it because it's in this kind of like larger, it's this larger image, and so you wouldn't necessarily see that person smiling, but that just kind of struck out to me as catching the variability of participation within a war context. And there might be someone who's like joyous about it. They're with their friends, they're there, and so you get me kind of going back to the images repeatedly and kind of seeing what's there. And maybe that's the wordlessness. Maybe the words might distract me from exploring the image the way that you're led to do. But what led you to kind of the wordlessness of the Great War?
Okay, I can't really take credit for some of this stuff because what happened is a friend of mine who is now is an editor at Norton, called me up and said, "Hey, remember once we talked about you doing a long image of the Western Front?" And I do remember we once got drunk and we were playing darts and we brought it up, and okay, I think I remember that. And he goes, "Well, now do you want to do it?" And his model was a book called Manhattan, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called Manhattan Unfurled or something like that. And it's an image of the Manhattan skyline, accordion style. You just pull it out. And it's really gorgeous, and there are no words to it. And he wanted me to draw an image of the Western Front. And, I had to wonder if I wanted to get involved in this project at all. But I've always been interested in the First World War since I was a kid. I mean, almost obsessed with it. So
Why?
I grew up in Australia. And in Australia, the First World War is really a part of their national psyche. Australia became Australia at Gallipoli. When they invaded Gallipoli and fought the Turks there, they shed blood, and suddenly they could remove themselves from the British. They had their defining moment. So we grew up, Australia really makes a big deal about the First World War. So I grew up with those stories, and that's why I could be interested in it. I was always particularly interested in this battle, in the first day of the Battle of the Somme, where the British had 60,000 casualties in the first day, and 20 of those 60,000, 20,000 killed. And to put that into context, that is way more. In the first hour, they lost more people than America lost in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. The first hour. So this always impressed me as a kid, as it should impress everyone. And so when he suggested it, I thought, maybe I should do penance for this little boy sort of obsession with the First World War and actually draw something. But I didn't like the idea of a static drawing. I thought, I want even though there's no words, you can have a narrative. And I thought about the Bayeux Tapestry, which shows the Norman invasion of England in 1066. You can read the tapestry from left to right. I think it goes on for more than 200 feet. And it tells a story. And I thought, well, I can tell the story, remove all the words. And I thought, okay, I'll start it with the General Haig, who organized this battle, and it'll end in the grave, because at the very end, they're burying soldiers, and I'll show everything in between. And because we in the West read from left to right, I thought, well, people are naturally going to start at the left and just move to the right. And so you can tell the story of the soldiers moving up, the bombardment. You can show the soldiers moving into the trenches, going over the top, and then coming back from the battle, and then the wounded going to the casualty clearing stations. You could actually have a narrative without words.
Truly, that's beautiful. How would you compare the challenges of writing your kind of more journalistic pieces from the historical ones? Do you see them as more or less being the same kind of process that you engage in? Or do you approach them in the same way?
To me, history and journalism are really interlinked. There are a lot of techniques I've learned just interviewing people about the present that you carry over to interviewing people about the past. And in the book Footnotes in Gaza in particular, I want to show how the present and the past weave together. What really interested me when I was there is that I would talk to someone who was in their 70s, late 60s or 70s, talking about what happened to them in 1956, because really that's what I was focusing on, 2 large-scale killings of Palestinian men in 1956. I would talk to them, and often, in these situations, you're in a room, and a lot of people are inside the room. It's not like you're just interviewing someone silently by yourself. There's always other people listening in. And often their sons and grandsons had never heard these stories before. And the question is, like, why hadn't they heard those stories? And again, it's because events are continuous. Like, why talk about what happened in 56 when your house is being demolished now? And often there were even sort of conflicts in a way. There's one scene in there where a guy's saying, why do you care about what happened in 56? Why don't you go 100 meters that way and see what the Israeli bulldozers are doing? And it was an interesting question, but to me, it's all linked. And history is kind of the foundation upon which a lot of things are built, obviously. And it's important to untangle that stuff and realize it's important to people who live through it. And you have to understand the context. Why are people resentful? I mean, we talk about incitement. Well, I mean, history is an incitement. If you actually know your history, it can incite you. So, I mean, we tend to poo-poo what happened in the past, and let's just put that aside. And I think the past is extremely important.
I remember someone made this comment once that they were like, to the Chinese, culture, their back is to the future and their front is towards the past. For Americans, we are reverse. Our back is to the past and we're pointing forwards, yeah.
Well, I mean, Obama says that sort of thing too. You know, talking about let's look ahead, not behind. And I think that's not always the right way to approach things. I think you have to talk about the past. Like, if you want to know why, you know, when I went back to, I talked about the Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon being killed. Well, why were they in Lebanon? Why weren't the Palestinians in their home villages? I mean, you have to trace it back to understand it. You know, facts today don't give you the whole story. They're facts, but let's not pretend that's giving you the story.
What's interesting about that image then is we have this kind of rotating figure that is looking both forward and backward concurrently over time. I'm wondering, with regards to your work, are you kind of also kind of reflective about your work and your path and kind of like the things you've done before? Do you rethink them? Do you think of alternative ways that you might have done some stuff, or is that infused into the kind of stuff that you're doing like presently, or things that you're kind of thinking about doing? That, okay, when I touch this topic, I'll kind of grab this element from this particular piece or do this. And so there's a constant evolution, I'm imagining, of how you're rethinking your craft. But are you doing the same thing with your own work that you just suggested, that you're looking back over what you've done and looking and reflecting in the present and then thinking about kind of like, okay, I like that element of this particular piece, let me add that here? Or do you just like each one is new? I mean, you clearly have a style, but to what extent is that kind of reflective process about looking forward and looking backwards taking place?
Well, I'd say that the easiest way to answer your question is to say my questions have begun to change. Because at some point, I think it was while I was working on the Footnotes in Gaza book, you know, I've worked on in these about conflict. I've drawn a lot of people shooting other people. And at some point you begin to think, I'm not sure if I understand what's going on here. I remember someone asking me after I had finished Footnotes in Gaza, he said, why don't you ever draw the faces of the Israeli soldiers? And I guess I hadn't realized that I wasn't drawing their faces, but I had to think it through. And I realized I couldn't draw their faces because I didn't understand what they were thinking. Because I assumed that these are ordinary men doing this. I think all these situations, you have ordinary people doing things that just seem extraordinarily violent, and you have to question. At some point I asked myself, if I cannot draw them because I cannot understand what they're thinking, so I have to get to that point of what are they thinking. So truthfully now I'm very interested in human psychology, in how crowds work, in behavior in a way. It's different from a journalistic question. Journalism is not answering all the questions I have. So truth be told, it's like I can explain they're fighting over this land. And this is why this happens, and this happened in history, and all that stuff is very, very important. But then there are other questions that have to do with us as a species that are also being pulled into the mix.
So your transition from the kind of journalism gets me to this point, and then I kind of need something else. That intersectionality, I think, is phenomenal. Do you know this guy Randall Collins?
I don't.
He's got this work called Political Violence, and his whole argument is similar to this guy Grossman, who wrote this book called On Violence, that we are genetically predisposed towards nonviolence. There's something about human beings that we're actually created in a way that leads us to not harm one another. And so for security force agents or people that want you to harm other people, we need to figure out how to get you to that point. And so this becomes this interesting point. How can you get people there? So it turns out that 5% of the population is more than willing to go there, but the rest of these people are not. And so it's about mixing the 5 with the 95 and then breaking down other people. But similarly, this issue of at what point do you feel that you kind of hit the parameters or boundaries of what journalism could do, and like what led you to the kind of philosophical kind of explorations of psychology? Did you kind of automatically go there, or are you kind of like, okay, I can't understand why this person pulled this trigger. Psychology might take me there. How do you get to that space?
Well, I mean, you realize that you don't know a lot of things, and I mean, what I'm doing now is just trying to accumulate knowledge. I'm reading a lot. Not just psychology, I'm reading like evolutionary biology. And then, you think, oh, I need to read philosophy. I mean, there's a lot of things I didn't study when I was in school. And I'm trying to go back to those things now and look at them and see what I can get out of them. So I'm interested in political science now. I mean, I'm interested in what Thomas Hobbes said. Things that I didn't think about before. I'm beginning to think maybe I need to know a little more theory. But it's all an educational process. I certainly don't have any answers now.
I'm curious also, so with the expansiveness that you have with regards to fields and experiences and so forth, I'm wondering, has that influenced your kind of artistic choices? Do you find that you've always been kind of expansive? I mean, there's some amazing images you have in Palestine that I could always go back to and see something new. And so there's this expansiveness that you have, but also then you're able to zoom into these amazing details. But I'm wondering now if you have this greater sensitivity towards different disciplines and different kind of nuances. So sociology is more about networks, and psychology is more about how people are thinking like as individuals and so forth, but maybe connected to groups. Has that infusion of new knowledge influenced how you think you now approach kind of drawing itself? Odd question, I admit, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, to be honest. I mean, I know that sometimes people say something about my work, and I haven't thought really about it that way, but actually that's insightful, because often when you're just instinctually doing stuff, you're not aware of certain things, and they suggest something. Yeah. So of course I'll take that into consideration, but there have been times when people have said, like someone wanted me to do something for a magazine and said, I want it to be like your other work where the landscape is one of the characters. And I thought, wow, I hadn't thought of my work that way, but it made me think about landscape and what that means to people and what it means in terms of art. And now I almost try to emphasize it. Like I'm working on a long book now about Indigenous people in Northern Territories in Canada, and the land is very important to them. So how do I show the land, and how do I do it in a way that's different from how I've shown it before, because they have a very different way of looking at the land. And I came across this idea of not using panels, but letting the drawings run into each other, and not having these hard borders, because they have just such a more open way of thinking of things, and they don't think in terms of boxes, I think. So that's one way I've tried to sort of use the art itself to sort of go with looking at a society and thinking about how would they present themselves, or how would they suggest. And you sort of think about those sorts of things.
So as you suggested earlier, that anger is quite frequently a motivating element to get you to a topic. What got you to the Native American topic, if I may?
Oh, Indigenous people. This is Canada.
Ah, okay.
I'm thinking about the planet, and I'm thinking about climate change, and it does feel like we are headed toward the cliff, and it just seems it's very well marked as a cliff, but we're going to go anyway, or someone's going to drag us along, and that pisses me off. And I thought, okay, I will try. I thought in my head now, what I'm thinking is trying to look at different Indigenous groups in different places and how they are responding to that. And Indigenous people in Canada have it's an ambivalent relationship with the oil extraction industry. I thought, preconceived notion, that Indigenous people are going to be against resource extraction. And then you get there and you realize, well, these are the only jobs they have. And then why are they the only jobs they have? And then you realize, oh, actually 50 years ago, they didn't think in terms of jobs, really. They were a lot of people living in the bush, and they were subsistence hunters. And so how did they get from being subsistence hunters to wage earners that depended on those oil jobs? And suddenly you're thinking about colonialism, and you begin to think, okay, I've got to expand this, and you just naturally grow into it. You just have to be open to not keep yourself in your original idea of what you're going to find, and let it sort of expand you, I guess.
So does this book go over a 500 or 1,000 year period, or are you establishing it as some kind of more contemporaneous element? Because just listening to you describe it, you could see going back to when indigenous folks were just there by themselves, and then this imposition of states comes, and then these distinct nations, and then they're competing with one another, and then they're destroying the indigenous communities. It could seem like it could go back quite a ways.
It can. I mean, I'm trying to touch on.
Not to jump
No.
into your next topic.
No.
Yeah.
I'm trying to touch on how indigenous people got incorporated into the state, because frankly, the state didn't care. This Northwest Territories, I mean, you can't really farm that land. It's freezing, and it's just not built for farming, so it wasn't really good for settlers. So the government didn't care about it, but once they found resources, then the government cared about it. Then the government, which was nominally in charge there, began to actually figure it out. You know, now they have to take charge of the people, and they have to take charge of the land. So I go back into that. But really, what I tried to get from people is, how did they live before? And there, people my age would have grown up, a lot of them would have grown up in the bush, or at least spent part of their lives in the bush. And it's really fascinating. A completely different cosmology and worldview, which is really interesting.
We talked about this earlier, but you clearly love Jim Scott's work. I mean, The Art of Not Being Governed is about people who decide that they purposely don't wish to live in states because of this imposition of power and all the things that kind of follow from that. So I think you'll be a fan of that piece immediately. There are quite a few young folks here today, and many might have an aspiration to kind of continue in this genre that you're helping to create and inspire and have blazed forward. You kind of might have anticipated this one, but like, what suggestions do you have for like some young folk that might wish to kind of get into comic and graphic art? Or how would you speak to the younger you? What would you say to the younger Joe Sacco regarding their development of the craft? If you talk to you.
Yeah, okay, if you talk to me. Sometimes he does in my dreams. You know, I think perseverance is really important. I know a lot of people who over the years sort of dropped out because it's difficult. I mean, I think I was 40 before I didn't worry about how to pay next month's rent. And that's a long time. And if you're too sane, you'll drop out. And you probably should. But if you're doing comics, it takes a lot of work. You have to recognize that. I would try to tell, I mean, I really have I like people telling stories they know, where they really know things. You know, fiction can be about what you know, obviously. So that's what I would recommend going forward, but it's a lot of work, and to do it right takes time, and you've got to be in a space that allows you to do that, or you've got to be willing to sleep on the floor for a few years, you know, that kind of thing. That's arts in general, I think. I mean, the arts are never easy.
So you mentioned the Indigenous Project, as we have you. Do you work on multiple things simultaneously?
I do.
Can you hint at what else you got?
Well, actually,
and what led you there?
Okay, this is up your alley in a way. It's I'm doing a book about a riot that took place in India in 2013 in a small district called Muzaffarnagar in UP, Uttar Pradesh, and small by the standards of riots. Maybe a few score people killed and 50 to 100,000 people displaced. And I specifically went there because I was interested in what people tell themselves about the riot a year later. And you can hear what people are telling you, and then you can sort of disprove it because you can still find the people that are there that witnessed it. But it was a riot. It took place between Hindus and Muslims. And, you know, both sides are using, you know, you sit down with people and you hear things and you know enough about the situation when you know you're hearing things that, you know, probably didn't happen quite that way. And that's what it's about. And it's about crowds and how crowds work. And it's not that I know about these things, but I'm actually trying to read about it now, but I got a bit ahead of myself and ended up looking at crowds and how crowds can sometimes, I think, pull not just people themselves, but the leaders try to get out in front of a crowd. It's not always about, crowds can be manipulated, and they are manipulated, and they're manipulated for political ends. But crowds also have a mind of their own, in a way, and I need to understand that a little more. But I'm working on that. And then I'm working on some other things, too.
Definitely want to, I don't know if you'll go there, but definitely want to, there's a great, this guy named Paul Brass who's got this book called Theft of an Idol, which is really similar to yourself. He was doing some interesting work on kind of cataloging riots and so forth in India. And then he came across this one thing that by his definition would be a riot, but it wasn't in his database, and he's just like, I wonder why. And so unlike most social scientists, he actually went to the place to figure out why it wasn't there. And he's talking to them and listening to people describe it, and it's just like, this should be a riot. But then he realized that the way the people viewed it in their minds, it didn't qualify as what he was designating it as. And there were these distinct kind of, it varied almost by the cast, how they were describing this particular event. For some, it was a misconception. Others, it was a mistake. Others, it was just like this kind of unfortunate thing that kind of took on this momentum of its own. And another one was like a manipulation of one cast of another. And it was just like, it became this fascinating piece, like one of my favorite movies, Rashomon, Akira Kurosawa, this kind of similar kind of dynamic. So that would be kind of like a cool thing to think about. But I was wondering how you would deal with this kind of mass, like riots are interesting, right? We always have a sense of what they're like. But there's also an individualistic element to it. So you have individuals amidst the crowd. And I'm wondering, you do this quite well. I mean, this is one of my favorite images that you've done, which is an interesting combination of kind of like crowd, context, and individuals. You still get a sense of the individuals at the same time. How do you find that balance? Do you find it difficult to maintain that balance, or this medium lends itself perfectly towards you can have a collective sense of having a lot of people, and you could still kind of depict people individually to start to maintain that element?
I sort of have this, when I'm drawing huge crowds, you know, it's a lot of work, obviously. I always think to myself, okay, slow down. Everyone had a mother. You know, I kind of think in those terms. And that this person you're drawing, you're inventing, and sometimes you're killing them, like in that Great War thing, you're killing them, and you're drawing this person. It's not just like, oh, bodies are like this. You're actually, you have to sort of think about it. And so that's how I try to think about it. And it helps me center on individuals even in those bigger scenes.
Wow, that's amazing. Part of the awareness, the self-awareness that you have of your work, I also find to be kind of intriguing. Do you find that you're at all able to be objective about any of this? Like your creation is kind of there, it's out in the world, people read it, people respond to it. How do you kind of relate to the work? I guess it's like, are these your children? Are these kind of like just, are they missiles that you're firing out? I mean, like, how are you connected to this? Because it's so personal. I mean, like, one of the reasons why I wanted to lead with some of the images of your studio is kind of like, and we talked about this briefly before, but you create in this bubble of sorts, and then from that, you then release that to the world. Do you stop thinking about it at that point? Do you maintain connections with it? How do you connect with your work that's been distributed?
Well, it's interesting because probably a lot of the connection comes through talks like this, because then you bring up older works I've done, which I mean matter to me, and I don't think of them as, oh, I got rid of that, now I only care about what I did, what I'm doing now. I'm not quite like that. There is part of me though that does want to keep moving, and you realize that all those old books matter because they were what is building you up towards something. Even the directions I'm taking, you have a direction because you didn't quite answer those questions in the earliest book, or those questions come up because of the earlier books. But I think it's a good idea not to think about it too much and just sort of let it be what it is. And just let it, because you want to keep moving forward too. And to think always about those older books is going to sort of keep you there in a way.
No, that's fair, that's fair. What do you think is, what do you kind of, it's like, what does Joe Sacco struggle with? I'm like, so it's kind of more of an issue of, what do you think is very hard to kind of capture graphically? I mean, not that you're like Superman, you can handle all these topics, but you've dealt with war, you've dealt with occupation, you've dealt with kind of riot policing, now you're going to deal with riots. It's just like, as you're dealing with these topics, what elements of them do you find to be the hardest to kind of capture visually?
I think depicting violence has become more real to me in a way, and thus much more distasteful. I actually don't like doing it, and we had this conversation about 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said, I'm never going to do a story about conflict like that. Let's say violent conflict again, because all stories are about conflict. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do something about the indigenous people, but it's also one of the reasons that those questions I mentioned, that why do people do this? I still have this sort of tick in my head, just sort of going off to saying you still need to figure this out. But to be honest, I don't enjoy doing some of these books. Earlier, like when I was working on the Palestine book, there was sort of this, wash my face in the morning and literally jump on the drawing table, and I'd go until 11 o'clock and then I'd have breakfast. I'm not quite like that anymore. Now it's like, oh, I gotta draw those bodies. I don't feel like doing that. It's like it just added up over time.
Do you think that, that's actually hard to talk about. You kind of forget in many respects that you have you as the artist, and then you have the subject, and then what I love about your work is you explicitly insert yourself into these spaces. That conscious decision, I think, humanizes the topic. It helps the viewer and reader go with you to these places. But do you think that you're more conscientious about not going into the, do you find that you kind of balance that in many respects? So sometimes you immerse yourself more, like in Palestine, or pull yourself out a little bit more, like in journalism? It's like, it seems to be kind of varied.
It is varied. I mean, a lot depends on who you're meeting. I mean, sometimes you meet people and you have this connection with them, and you realize this person is going to be a friend of mine for life. And I allow that to happen. I'm not so dispassionate. The way we were taught in journalism school is just, you've got to be, and you do. I mean, to some extent, you've got to be careful. You've got to pull yourself out a bit. I think I'm able to do that and establish human relationships with people. I don't think the two things necessarily conflict. So, now wait, we're talking about, I'm sorry, I just lost the train of thought there. What was the question? Because I was getting to something.
No, we have this fluid kind of thing where I'm just like, I'm now into the next question. So I'm like,
all right,
I can't
go into the
remember
next
what I asked
question.
you, yes. No.
You've got a partial answer.
No, it's partly this issue of, it's intriguing to figure out exactly how your mind works with regards to how you're thinking of the craft and what elements you're piecing together and in what sequence, and how fluid that is in many respects. And so I feel kind of, I feel bad because I feel like I'm adding this kind of intrusive element. It's just like, let's stop your whole creative process and let's dissect it on a table and slice it up a little. And like, so now I'm stepping back from trying to do that and think more organically and try to go where you've gone. It's like I have to know what these other topics are that you're working on. I'm just like, I find that to be kind of fascinating. But do you walk around just finding yourself just getting pissed all the time and like finding new topics and putting it in a drawer? Or do you like save the anger? It needs to hit a certain threshold before you're kind of like, okay, that's worth taking on? Because it seems like you could take on so many topics simultaneously that would be overburdening, especially if you feel about them the way you seem to care about these people, and hence I come back to this piece on the kids because some of the pieces that you illustrate are so visceral, they're so powerful, and you're just like, I know that must have affected you. I mean, from my work on Rwanda, I remembered seeing like a room full of dead bodies covered in lye in these distorted positions, and it's like, I've never forgotten that. And I can still smell it every now and then. And so clearly when you're talking with people that have been imprisoned or people that have lost body parts and seeing the physical spaces where they used to live, it takes a toll. So it's kind of like, it seems almost like human that you would have this threshold. It's like, okay, I can only take on so many of these things and still survive and still live. So I'm just wondering about, do you juggle multiple ones and you're kind of like, that helps you deal with the power of any one of them, or do you like do deep immersion?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I've started taking on more than one project, and the two I've mentioned to you are the sort of the journalistic hard ones, but I've started to do satirical work that will sort of make me want to draw again. You know, like I mentioned before, I got in it because I wanted to make people laugh. And with satire, I think you can make people laugh, but also I can express some part of this anger that I seem to have. Express it. I'm working on things now that are kind of very dark, but very delightful, if you know what I mean. For me personally as an artist.
Like a Life is Beautiful kind of dark?
No. Because I don't think in those terms, but drawing is beautiful. I mean, I can draw things that, they're not beautiful drawings necessarily, but they kind of give me a kick. They sort of make me, humor provides a filter towards certain topics that I've already dealt with before. I'm working on this one image now for one of my projects that shows probably 100 different leaders from the beginning of time, from the city of to modern day, just all of them in like a parade. And that comes out of a certain anger, but it's really fun to draw. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. And there's something about journalism itself that has become more difficult for me because it's actually okay to be in a place and to talk to people and to get their story and to hear that story. It's harder to draw that story because it's so much more intimate, strangely. So now I need to mix it up a bit. It's out of necessity that I've learned to mix it up.
So would you agree that your ability as an ethnographer, your ability to kind of sit down, so Joe has this element, if anyone knows an anthropologist, this is like a good sign. It's like, Joe's got this ability, like when you sit down with him, you feel automatically calmed. So I don't get the anger bit. It's like you sit down with him and you're calm. It's like talking to a therapist, which is like talking to an anthropologist. Like basically, they get you to that space where you're just kind of like, yes, I will reveal all of my secrets to you. And then you feel very comfortable in that space. And so I could see why you're able to get there because you're aware, you're insightful, you're interested, you get the leaning in, you get all of the engagement that is like so human. And so at the same time, it's interesting to hear you say that you acknowledge that is an intimacy, but you make that kind of creative choice to characterize that visually and to share that. You don't feel, not in a kind of like, so at university systems we're occasionally hindered by these IRB boards that try to tell you what you should do with your research and how you protect individuals and so forth. You're, in a sense, not that you're not protecting individuals, but you're telling their story for this political purpose. So the sense of violation of intimacy weighed against this issue of telling the story for the greater social good. Do you feel kind of like this tension between, do you feel that you're violating the intimacy by distributing it and or depicting it? Are there some stories that you don't draw because you're just like, I can't put that one in there because you just don't want to go there, or you're just kind of like, all right, you know what, I'm all in. I heard them all, I'm telling them all.
Well, I mean, comics works in interesting ways. You can lead person to violence in a story and then show it, or you can lead person to violence and not show it, and then the reader does the violence for you, which is in some ways worse, I think, for a reader. It depends on what you're trying to do. I want to be careful. I mean, I realize when people give you their stories, it's like something that you have to be very careful about. And one thing I'm always troubled about, and I don't know how to answer it, really. I don't know how to sort of answer this question myself, but I worry about someone tells me their story, then I draw it, and I try to get visual references, and I try to draw it as best I can so it reflects something about their experience, but I think to myself, am I pouring concrete on their story? Are they going to remember their story my way rather than how it happened for them? Because sometimes stories are told and they reinforce other stories. Sometimes things didn't happen to you, but you've heard it enough that it did happen to you. So I worry that where am I in that mix? And it's not something I've answered for myself, but I try to be aware of it. I try to be aware that this is, there's a reason I'm telling these stories, because I think people should know. And I recognize that if I had to explain to you some of the things, some of the work I've done like this, I would probably be very insufferable. You know, my frustration would show. Maybe my voice would get really high or something like that. Comics and art is my way of putting in that filter to make it so that it's in a product that you can actually assimilate. And that's the whole point. I don't think I would be good going on campus talking about what I've seen in the West Bank or in Bosnia or something like that. I wouldn't be good at it. This is how I do it. It filters out the anger in a way, because the anger is making the work. That's where it goes. That's why it doesn't sort of exude out of me. I'm not actually a very angry person. I'm not walking around like just
The whole
boiling. No, I'm not like that. When I say anger, to me it's the most constructive, one of the most constructive and human emotions there is, and we're often told, don't be so angry. So, well, maybe you should be angry, but just learn to be, how to put that so it's effective. I mean, put that anger somewhere, because it's important to have that anger. There are a lot of reasons to be angry.
Given that today is Thursday, and tomorrow is what it is, I can think of no better way to end. Right.
Thank you.